Hello. I hope it's not too jarring to see this new angle of my apartment. I'm sitting at just like a different chair at the same table. Want me to even prove it to you? Look it. That's the background I had last time. But I thought it could be fun to switch it up. Although now I'm looking and I'm just like, this isn't quite as nice of a background. There's no plant. Although Pearl on the floor down there if you're one of the people that likes to know where she is. Oops, it's so hard. Okay, there she is. Ugh. Anyway, okay, I was on page 276 at the very bottom of page 276. I have to make sure. I accidentally missed a meeting this morning, which was really dumb of me. So now I'm just like checking my email because I keep getting nervous that there's suddenly going to be more emails and more meetings that I'm missing. But it was just the one. Disregard for law, of course, implies regard for that which law is a barrier against. Naked force, power sufficient to bend society or individuals, if not protected by law, to its will. And this, too, now became noticeable in the character of Robert Moses. Moses was playing by the rules of power now, and one of the first of those rules is that when power meets greater power, it does not oppose but attempts to compromise. He had met power invulnerable to him, or even to his champion in the governor's chair, in the barons of Long Island's North Shore, and where once, in laying out the original route of the Northern State Parkway exactly where he believed it should ideally go, laying it out without compromise, running it right past the massive porticos of the barons' castles, he had spat in the eye of power. Now, he hastily administered eyewash. I feel like Robert Caro only gives us metaphors when they're a really fun one. Like he doesn't do any half-assed metaphors. And I liked the eyewash thing. I thought that was nice. He would not move the parkway route down out of the hills the barons held and onto the plains in the island center. This would mean that the parkway could never be truly beautiful. But within the hills, there were many parkway routes, and he was willing to compromise with the barons on which route would finally be chosen. He made deals with at least a dozen barons he covenanted. Also, we have a little visitor here. She's playing with the cord of my computer. He made deals with at least a dozen barons. He covenanted that he would move the parkway away from the homes to the edges of their property, out of sight of their castles, if they would in return donate the right-of-way so that he would not need a legislative appropriation for it. With a dozen more, where moving it to their estate's borders was impractical, he agreed to move it as far as was practical, and so the estate would not be sliced in half by the parkway, so that equestrians could proceed unchecked on their rides and hunts, to build, at state expense, bridges, one for each estate, over the parkway, for the exclusive use of the baron in residence and his retainers and guests. Wow. The compromising did not stop there. Were the barons afraid that the alien hordes brought to Long Island on the parkway might encroach on their lands? Protections against this could be arranged. Specifically, he would covenant with the concerned barons that there would be no exits from the parkway within their borders. And he gave his solemn oath that state troopers patrolling the parkway would be under orders to keep automobiles from the city moving, not allowing their occupants to picnic, or even to stop by the side of the parkway within their borders. Publicly, Moses never stopped excoriating the Long Island millionaires. But in private, many of them were coming to consider him quite a reasonable fellow to deal with. None found him more reasonable than financier Otto Kahn. In dealing with Kahn, Moses, in his excursions beyond the limits of the spirit of the law, went further than he had ever gone before. The legislature, subservient to the will of the barons, refused all through 1924, 25, 26, and 27 to give Moses assent for the Northern State Parkway. Funds were refused even for the surveying of proposed routes, a refusal which made it almost impossible for Moses to work out details with the barons because he could not be sure whether routes proposed were engineeringly feasible. But in 1926, Khan learned that Moses intended to run the parkway right through the middle of the 18-hole private golf course he had constructed for his pleasure on his Cold Spring Harbor estate. Can you believe it? Can you believe it, Pearl? There's going to be a road through the golf course. How could this happen? I like to imagine Pearl would, if she were like a human on long. I like to imagine Pearl in history as being an aristocrat. She just feels very fancy to me. She would let them eat cake. Khan, who happened to be a relative of Moses, he was married to the daughter of one of Bella's sisters, offered to secretly donate $10,000 to the Park Commission for surveys, if some of the surveys found a new route for the parkway in the Cold Spring Harbor, in the Cold Spring Harbor area, a route which would not cross his estate at all. And Moses accepted the money. Oh, hi, Andrew. Wow. Regard for power implies disregard for those without power, as is demonstrated by what happened after Moses shifted the route of the Northern State Parkway away from Otto Kahn's golf course. The map of the Northern State Parkway in Cold Spring Harbor is a map not only of a road, but of power, and of what happens to those who, unwittingly, are caught in the path of power. The parkway was originally supposed to run through Otto Kahn's estate. Since Otto Kahn had power, the power that went with money, he was able to get the route shifted to the south. South of Otto Kahn's estate lay the estates of two other men of wealth and of influence with the legislature. Oh, these are two names we've heard before. Congressman Ogden Livingston Mills and Colonel Henry Rogers Winthrop. But really all I remember about those people is that they were rich. Okay. The congressman and the colonel were able to get the route shifted farther south, far enough so it would not touch their estates either. But shifting the route south of the Mills and Winthrop estates meant that it would run through the estates of two other men of wealth and influence, Colonel Henry L. Stimson and Robert W. DeForest. So the route was shifted south again, and south of the Stimson and DeForest estates lay a row of farms, and farms had neither wealth nor influence. James Roth was one of those farmers. When he had purchased his 49 acres in 1922, much of it had been woodland, and all of it had been rocky. Roth had hauled away the rocks and cut down the trees. He owned a team of horses, but they could not budge many of the stumps. As the horses pulled at them, Roth pulled beside them. So did his wife, Helen. I really feel like I should start a tally for the number of times that, like, a wife makes an appearance, because it's got to be, like, less than 5. So that both would be freed for the pulling, their son Jimmy, at the age of 5, had learned how to handle the team. As his parents sweated at the ropes, he sat on one of the horses, kicking him forward. After the farm was cleared, the Roths found that the southern 15 acres were no good for planting, but the rest of the land was rich and fertile. In the afternoons during harvest season, James Roth, who had been up since before dawn working in the fields, would load up one of his 2 wagons and drive it to market. When he was gone, his wife and son, who in 1927 was 6, would load the other. When Roth returned, he would, without pause, since every minute was important to a farmer trying to work 34 acres without a hired man, unharness the team, hitch it to the loaded wagon, and begin the trip again, while Helen and Jimmy would reload the first wagon. But by 1927, the farm had begun paying. We felt pretty secure, Jimmy recalls. We had a nice farm. In those days, a farm wasn't just estate like it is now. It wasn't just real estate like it is now. In those days, a farm was your living, it was your home, and we had a nice farm. Then, in 1927, a representative of the Long Island State Park Commission of Robert Moses drove up to the Roth's farm and told them the state was condemning 14 acres out of the farm center for the Northern State Parkway. James Roth argued with Moses' representative. He pleaded with him. All he wanted the commission to do, Roth said, was move the parkway route about 400 feet south, less than a tenth of a mile. That would put it in the barren part of the land. Taking 14 acres from the center meant that a substantial part of the fertile acreage would be gone. Even more important, it meant that the farm would be sliced in two. How would he get from one side to the other? How would he be able to work it? But Moses' representative refused to listen to the Roths. The route had been decided on the basis of engineering considerations, he said. It could not possibly be shifted. Robert Moses, okay, if you're just coming, they're trying to build the southern, oh shoot. I actually can't remember. It's either, we're trying to build either the northern or the southern state parkway right now. Maybe I'm too sleepy. But it keeps getting shifted south because of all the rich people being like, no, just make it more south than my land. But then they finally hit this like kind of seemingly middle class guy, and he's just totally getting screwed. And his name is James Roth. Okay. He wouldn't offer James Roth a bridge so that there would be no interference with his planting. Robert Moses had offered men of wealth and influence bridges across the parkway so that there would be no interference with their pleasures, but he wouldn't offer James Roth a bridge. In years to come, James Roth would talk about the injustice that had been done him. My father was really rocked by this. He talked about it until the end of his life, says his son Jimmy, who had watched his father and mother sweating side by side over their land. And I don't know that I blame him. I'll tell you, my father and mother worked very hard on that place and made something out of it. And then someone just cut it in two. To have someone take away something you love, the farm never really paid again. There just wasn't enough fertile acreage left. And the Roths found it took fully 25 minutes to drive their team to the nearest road that crossed the parkway and then get back to plow the other side of the farm. That's so evil. Each round trip took about 50 minutes, and these were 50-minute segments slashed out of the life of a man to whom every minute was necessary. It was quite a ways, Mrs. Roth recalls. It was quite a ways for a man who was working hard already. The condemnation award never came to much, Mrs. Roth said. And because there were two separate, rather small pieces of property instead of a single big one, she says, they couldn't even sell the farm. The situation was the same for the other Cold Spring Harbor farmers whose farms were ruined by the Northern State Parkway. Okay, it's the northern. It makes so much more sense now why they're concerned about shifting it south, because it's supposed to be so north. It's the Northern State Parkway. Okay, to the end of their lives, most of the farmers would remember the day on which they heard that the road was coming as a day of tragedy. There was only one aspect of the tragedy that alleviated the bitterness. That was their belief that it was unavoidable, that the route of the parkway had indeed been determined by engineering considerations, and therefore really could not be changed. 40 years later, when the author asked them about the possibility of the parkway being built through the big estates to the north, not one of those farmers thought that such a possibility had ever existed. I need to show you my mug first. I went to the Atomic Museum in Nevada, and I just thought the mug was so dramatic because on one side it has Robert Oppenheimer in front of the bomb which is going off, and on the other side it has E equals MC squared. And I just was like, I need to buy that. And then I bought 2 more to give as gifts. Yeah, I know Pro really likes it. Wait, speaking of big meaty books, I haven't read this book, but my boyfriend has been like really telling me to read it. Basically, when I started liking The Power Broker, he was like, "Oh, Annie, you need to read the big Richard Rhodes book about the atomic bomb." So I think that's gonna be maybe next on my list, or maybe Gödel Escher Bach. I read part of it. I read like I would say half. Like I spent a really long time of my life going through about half, but then I kind of like let it. I stopped, but I need to finish that someday. Anyway, Moses was given a further increase in power as a result of Smith's bid for the presidency in 1928. No associate of the governor was more enthusiastic about the bid than Moses. On the June night, when the Democratic Party was balloting at its convention in Houston, and the executive mansion in Albany was overflowing with reporters. By the way, we just looked it up, and that little detail about the executive mansion in Albany having monkeys and other exotic creatures, that's definitely true. And there's really there's credible information about it, but it's not on Wikipedia. There aren't really I remember there weren't really news articles about it. So if anyone's looking for a fun little thing to write about on Wikipedia, you could add the monkeys at the New York Executive Mansion. Okay, anyway, I'm really going crazy with the asides today. If this bothers you, I asked like a couple weeks ago if this bothered people, and people were like, no, it's fine. But if it does bother you, I'm not offended. If you're like, just Annie, just read, please. Okay, it was overflowing with reporters, well-wishers, and hangers-on. The porches and the grounds outside filled with throngs. Moses was one of the handful who were invited to join the Smith family in the big second room floor in which the governor was trying to listen to the balloting over the static. When Ohio's votes gave Smith the nomination and Emily Smith ran to her father and threw her arms around his neck, it was to Moses that Belle Moskowitz turned and said, almost crying, "Bob, it's over." And other people in the room were to say that they had never seen Moses happier than at that moment. Belle's remark was, after all, understandable. Al Smith had run in 22 elections and had won 21, and in the one he had lost, he had ran almost 1 million votes ahead of his ticket. She and Moses and the other members of the Smith inner circle in the room with the governor didn't see how he could lose. Al Smith got up from the big armchair in which he had sat for hours, his attention on the radio, motionless except for the grinding of his lips against his big cigar and the stroking of one hand on the neck of his Great Dane, Jeff. I'm just underlining that. I can't believe this whole time he's had a Great Dane named Jeff and we didn't hear about it. That really, that's awesome. Okay, so he's stroking Jeff. He walks over to a small bar, grabs 2 handfuls of ice cubes, began dropping them into glasses, and said, "Now all of yez, come aboard." I love Al Smith. He just loves animals, drinking, reading the laws, and the Fourth Ward. I feel like those are he just loves that. He seems so not that many people in this book seem like they would be fun to hang out with. I really mean that. I don't think I would want to hang out with Robert Moses because he's always manipulating you. But Al Smith seems so fun. Moses did not play a major role in the Smith presidential campaign. I feel like if Al Smith were alive today, he would be really he would definitely just spend a bunch of money to add pickleball to the roof of City Hall or something so that he could play on his lunch break. Don't you think he would do so? I don't know. Moses did not play a major role in the Smith presidential campaign. The governor had long since stopped using him as a speech drafter. He had a great respect for Bob's viewpoint on everything except speeches, Howard Coleman says. The governor said Bob would just murder him on those. He said Bob had no idea of the public pulse on most issues. And the campaign was run by Mrs. Moskowitz and by a group of wealthy Irish Catholics who had recently become close to Smith. So Moses was spared being with his Gamaliel when he went down to defeat in what Oscar Handlin has called a dark episode in American history. He wasn't with him when, on his tours of a South and a West that he hardly knew, Smith realized that the gay renditions of The Sidewalks of New York were being drowned out by whispers that were the surface hissing of what Handlin has called the dark secret prejudice against the urban foreigners, including Catholics, held in subservience to a foreign despot by an army of priests and bishops. That's so crazy. Moses never saw the fiery crosses that burned on the hills of Kansas and Oklahoma and on the Shinnecock Hills of Suffolk County as Smith's campaign train passed. Whoa, they're burning crosses because he's a Catholic. Moses wasn't on the train when the realization spread through it that the prejudice and intolerance could not be licked, and that even if it could, 1928, with the Hoover market booming, that was in quotes, and the nation prosperous and complacent, just wasn't a democratic year. Moses's contribution to the Smith campaign was twofold. First, his accomplishments provided the ammunition for the most successful of Smith's speeches, those which concentrated on his record as governor. Second, while Smith was campaigning, Moses ran the state for him. Just gonna run the state real quick. This was no minor task. Voters in 1928 were far less tolerant than those in 1974 are about office holders neglecting their duties to seek higher office. And Smith realized that the Republican legislators would take full advantage of any opportunity to charge him with laxness. To make sure there was no opportunity, Smith gave Moses full authority over all state departments during the months he spent on the campaign trail. He even told Moses to use his office and sit in his big chair in the executive chamber. Moses did so. He presided over the drawing up of the 1929 state budget, the first in the state's history to be drawn up under his executive budget plan. He handled the governor's mail, screening it for important letters that should be sent on to him, and making sure that he never saw the obscene threats that terrified Smith's wife, Katie, when she read them. When Smith was campaigning, Moses ran New York. And the measure of his success in the job was that there wasn't a single Republican charge of laxness in that period. Okay, I forgot the actual words, and I've probably brought this up before, but if you look up like list of U.S. president campaign slogans, Al Smith's was about it was about alcohol, but there was a sexual innuendo, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, and I just can't butcher it. Okay. So there are a few here. I'll start from like the least to most innuendo. The first one, honest, able, fearless. Al Smith. All for Al and Al for all. That's awesome. I like that one. Okay, then the last one, this is the one I remember. Make your wet dreams come true. Al Smith, referring to his stand in favor of repealing prohibition. And I also even looked it up. I was like, oh, did wet dreams like mean the same thing 100 years ago? And they definitely did. Like he was doing that to be a goofball. Make your wet dreams come true. Al Smith for America, 1928. I wonder if there's eBay like memorabilia of that. I would buy that. I don't think they sold like mugs like that back then. Or if they did, I haven't seen 100-year-old mugs because maybe they just broke, but I would pay probably $100 for a mug that said that. Oh, Wet Dreams also works for a man that supports beaches. Wow, it's a triple innuendo. Triple entendre. Moses had no opportunity to take pleasure from either his power or his success as Smith's surrogate. Time, which had for so long panted hungrily at his heels, had drawn close enough to nip them now. Smith had been prevented by law from running for governor at the same time he was running for president, and while a new governor could not oust Moses as Long Island Park Commission head, his 6-year term, after all, did not expire until 1930. He could effectively kill any of his park projects that were not well underway when he was inaugurated. And while Moses had accomplished so much during his 4 years in office, the accomplishments were as nothing beside his dreams. There was, in 1928, so much yet to do. Although the entire right-of-way for the Southern State Parkway had been acquired and construction started on most of it, not a single section had been completed. Without that section, the public would not see how great it was going to be and would not be ready to support him against any governor who tried to keep him from completing it up to the same expensive standards. The Wantock Causeway to Jones Beach was not completed, and since the public could not see the strand, how could it know he was justified in the expenditure of whatever millions were needed to make it the greatest bathing beach in the world? The Northern State Parkway was not even begun. Unless he could announce that a substantial portion of the right-of-way had been acquired, how could he force a new governor into building the road? So in November and December of 1928, construction crews were out on the Southern State and the Wantock, and the surveyors were out along the route of the Northern State. Okay, this is the last paragraph in the chapter. Those close to Robert Moses knew that there was justification for his urgency, a reason for the desperation which now seemed to underlie his haste. Without his loyalty to me, Moses was to say about Al Smith, I could have done nothing. He had had Al Smith and his loyalty for 10 years, but now he was to have Al Smith no more. And the man who was to follow Moses's great friend into the governor's chair was Moses's deadliest enemy. Oh man, this is great. We had 2 chapters without zinger endings, but we are so back, baby. We are so back. I'm gonna probably read like one more page or maybe 2. The next chapter is called The Feather Duster, chapter 17. I can't wait for him to have an enemy governor. This is so exciting. We're really gonna start brokering that power. There is an expression used in Albany to describe the relationship of 2 men between whom there exists bad feeling when that feeling has existed for years, has resisted every attempt at reconciliation, and has only deepened with the passage of time to a point where dislike is not so fitting a name for it as hatred. In discussing 2 such men, one assemblyman will say to another, with a knowing shake of the head, they go back a long way. Get ready for this. Wow. It's a familiar character, you guys. It's someone you know. Whether you've read this book or not, you really can't not know this guy. Robert Moses and Franklin Delano Roosevelt went back a very long way. I'm so excited. This might be one of those days where I accidentally read like all for an hour, which is fine. Roosevelt's relationship with the whole circle of advisors around Al Smith was an ambivalent one. They needed him and they knew it. Any Irish Catholic, city-bred, militantly wet, that's because of Prohibition, Tammany politician, even an Al Smith, needed help with the Protestant farm-bred, militantly dry, Tammany-hating upstate New York farmers. Upstate Democrats of stature were in short supply. In fact, Roosevelt was the only one. And you could hardly ask for a better ally. The tall, handsome, aristocratic Groton and Harvard graduate who looked exactly like the Hudson River squire he was, had won upstate acceptance of his anti-Tammany bona fides in 1911. During his first state senate term, by rallying a band of young colleagues and leading them to victory in what had seemed a hopeless cause, their fight against the selection for a vacant U.S. Senate seat of Silent Charlie Murphy's candidate, railroad frontman William F. Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan. And then there's an asterisk that says, until 1913, U.S. senators were selected by state legislatures. That feels like something I'm underlining. I didn't know that. I feel so ignorant of so many aspects of life before 1900. Honestly, before like I was born. But that, I don't know. I feel like I should have known that. Therefore, okay, so that was a crazy name. So railroad frontman William F. Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan. Of course he works on the railroad. Like you couldn't come up with a better railroad name than William F. Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan. Therefore, upstaters were willing to listen to Roosevelt when he told them, as he did at countless county fairs, that farmers like you and I should support Smith because the governor had risen above the Tammany background from which he had sprung. If, moreover, Smith had ambitions that went beyond New York State, and he did, he needed an emissary to the Democratic Party's rural, dry Protestant wing. And young Franklin bore a name which, throughout the country, possessed the magic that a half-century later would infuse the name Kennedy. More than one newspaper, praising his performance as the 1920 Democratic vice presidential nominee and noting that he had followed Cousin Teddy into the New York legislature and an assistant secretaryship of the Navy, had commented that if Teddy Roosevelt's sons proved unable to carry the old Rough Riders banner back up to the steps of the White House, there was another member of the family who might do it for him. His every intervention on Smith's behalf, I'm assuming that's Teddy Roosevelt's, his every intervention on Smith's behalf had been immensely helpful. Striding, athletic, and graceful, to the speaker's podium at the 1920 Democratic National Convention, he had seconded the governor's token presidential nomination in an effective speech. In July 1922, when Smith, out of office, we're definitely talking about FDR, not Teddy. When Smith, out of office, taking his evening walks home with Moses, Roosevelt, crippled now, got Smith's gubernatorial candidacy off the ground with an open letter calling on him to run. Whoa. It's crazy that we just didn't even, I love how he in this book, he withholds a lot of information so that he can just go he didn't talk about Al Smith at all, basically. And then we just went boom, Al Smith for 20 pages. And he's doing the same thing here. This is so fun. I have so many things I'm thinking about. I can't believe that FDR was one of the big reasons, other than that one guy. Remember that one guy who did he run a bar or something? And he would hang out in the Fourth Ward and just he was the boss. He would get all the votes and stuff and give everyone jobs. That guy and FDR were the two guys that got Al Smith into the governor's office. It's just kind of interesting. Okay. Floor manager for Smith at the 1924 National Convention, He had been his nominator too, swinging to the platform on crutches and delivering a speech that, using a phrase from Wordsworth, dubbed the governor the happy warrior of the political battlefield, a speech that historian Mark Sullivan called a noble utterance. Among Smith's happier moments during the convention's interminable, oh, that was a dumb moment, sorry, interminable 103 ballots were Roosevelt's appearances at the microphone to rally his supporters. So enthusiastic a Smith supporter was he that when the governor ran in 1926 against Teddy Roosevelt, the new Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and Franklin Roosevelt found himself physically unable to campaign against his cousin, he sent his wife to do it. Wow. To remind voters of Theodore Jr.'s connection, peripheral at worst, with the Teapot Dome oil scandal, Eleanor Roosevelt constructed a huge cardboard cutout of a teapot blowing steam, tied it on top of a car, and with it trailed her cousin-in-law around the state, a maneuver which she ruefully admitted had been a rough stunt. This is so, like, I guess, wow. That is so crazy. Imagine if your cousin's wife is driving behind your car with a big, like blow up teapot or cardboard teapot or whatever. That's so, like, remember when Melania wore that jacket that said, I don't even care, do you? When she was visiting children at the border? It feels like similarly petty, maybe even more. But Roosevelt was never really part of the Smith inner circle. As Oscar Handlin put it, he had been brought up in an atmosphere that stressed the compulsive understatement. It was inevitable that he should feel awkward in Smith's suite at the Biltmore. All those people. He may never actually have dined at the Tiger Room, but he must have heard stories of the goings-on. He could not, without denying his own background, fail to disapprove of the kinds of people Al and his friends were. And yet, as Handlin added, mingled with the disapproval was a touch of envy at being left out of the fun. Roosevelt obviously wished he had Moses's gift for blending in easily with the governor and his hard-drinking, hard-talking friends. Wanting to be part of the Biltmore scene, feeling awkward about going there alone, Roosevelt would, in 1923, often telephone Moses in the late afternoon from his office at 120 Broadway and ask if he might stop by, pick him up, and go up to the hotel with him. Moses took Roosevelt along, but the latter's appearances at the Biltmore were always touched with restraint. Smith appreciated Roosevelt's help and felt a genuine affection for him and Eleanor. Shy about his lack of grammar, the governor almost never wrote personal letters. But he wrote many to the Roosevelts after Campobello. Did you guys all know what Campobello is? I don't. Maybe that was like a big was Campobello like a moment in American history? Okay, for many years, FDR summered on Campobello Island in New Brunswick. I guess we were just supposed to know that. Oh, it's where he got polio. Okay, thanks for that. Maybe I'm a bad American. Maybe everyone is supposed to know that. I didn't know that. Thank you. Now I know. Okay, it's the first day of the rest of my life. Short, gruff notes full of sympathy and cheer. But despite the governor's efforts to erase it, the line between the Fourth Ward contract executor and the Ivy Leaguer, the line which Moses had so thoroughly erased in his own case, always remained drawn between Smith and Roosevelt. Once, with regret in his voice, Smith told a friend, "Franklin just isn't the kind of man you can take into the piss room and talk intimately with." Okay, I'm glad it's not just me. Now I know though. Now I'm gonna maybe now in conversation I'm just gonna be like, oh, it's kind of like FDR at Campobello. Maybe I'll just reference it. Furthermore, Smith and his circle had something less than respect for Roosevelt's abilities. This attitude was understandable. Roosevelt's Harvard classmates had felt the same way. Mocking his propensity for hopping into and out of different interests in quick and shallow succession, they called him the feather duster. After college, because of the same propensity, Roosevelt had not been a particularly successful lawyer or businessman. An acquaintance would recall that when, at the age of 28, he decided to enter politics, running for state senator from Dutchess County, everybody called him Franklin and regarded him as a harmless bust. In Albany, his haughty manner, accentuated by his habit of throwing up his head so as to give the appearance of looking down his nose, his pince-nez, all this combined with his leadership in the anti-Sheehan fight. Oh my gosh, yeah. I wish I remembered his name off the top of my head. The railroad guy, William F. Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan. And who was running for like state senator or something, stamped him as a snob and branded his ideas in the outraged language of one regular Democrat as the silly conceits of a political prig. I hope that doesn't mean anything bad. Francis Perkins was to remember him arguing with with two or three colleagues. His small mouth pursed up, saying, No, I won't hear of it. Tammany's Big Tim Sullivan was only summing up the prevailing opinion in Albany when he said, Awful, arrogant fellow, that Roosevelt. Moreover, as Handlin notes, to the hard, shrewd men around the governor who had clawed their way up through a tough world and who knew state government in detail, Roosevelt, with his airy plans, his many hobbies, and his glittering, sweeping discourses, seemed a hopelessly impractical intellectual. For the same reason, Smith's advisors overlooked the fact that not silent Charlie Murphy, but the political prig, FDR, had been the winner of the Sheehan fight. And after his polio attack in 1921, Campobello, as some call it, they did not seem to consider what it had taken for Roosevelt to decide to go back into politics at a time when, Eleanor Roosevelt was later to recall, he was lying in bed and working for hours to try to wiggle one toe. Roosevelt's head had always been tilted at that gay, confident angle. They didn't seem to think of the strength that had to be found somewhere to keep it tilted now. The agonizing steps he had taken to the podium to give his happy warrior speech were the manifestation of an indomitable spirit, but Smith's intimates never thought of the speech without giggling over what had preceded it. The story, as they knew it, would be somewhat different from that recounted by historians, or by Dory Sherry, who, in a book, Sunrise at Campobello, portrayed FDR as saying, when Smith asked him to let Joseph Proskauer help write the speech, I won't mind the addition of a few phrases, but Al, what I say will have to be what I say. Actually, when Smith and Proskauer walked into Roosevelt's office at Smith campaign headquarters and asked him to make the nominating speech, Roosevelt replied, I'd like to, but I'm so busy with the delegates. Joe, will you write me a speech? I had already written a speech, the Happy Warrior speech, Proskauer would tell the author. I waited a few days and then sent it to him. He asked me to come in and talk about it. He said, Joe, I can't make that speech. It's too poetic. You can't quote a Wordsworth poem to a bunch of politicians. Proskauer told the author, and so did Smith's daughter Emily and two other Smith intimates, that I don't know who he is, that's why I'm confused. he kept insisting on retaining the Happy Warrior line, while Roosevelt kept insisting that it be removed. Oh, the speechwriter Proskauer. Okay. Otherwise, Roosevelt said he would refuse to give the speech. Roosevelt even wrote a speech of his own. Finally, Proskauer recalled, I said, why didn't we get a third person to come and take a look and try to reconcile the two speeches? I said, I was thinking of Herbert Bayard Swope. He said, fine. That night, we went to Frank's apartment. Swope made a faux pas. We hadn't told him who had written them, and he read Frank's speech first, threw it on the floor, and said, Joe, this is the goddamnedest, rottenest speech I've ever heard. Then he read mine. I'm hiccuping. Proskauer's, and he said, this is the greatest speech since Bragg nominated Cleveland. What an outdated thing to say. I would love to start saying that. Maybe I'll just say that to my boyfriend and see what he does. Oh, good. Okay, this is the greatest speech since Bragg nominated Cleveland. There's a footnote for that, and I'm reading it. At the 1884 Democratic National Convention, General Edward S. Bragg seconded, not nominated, Grover Cleveland for president in a speech that was so eloquent it included the memorable phrase, they love him for the enemies he has made. That gallery stood and urged him on with shouts of, a little more grape, General, a little more grape. I don't know what grape means in that context. I'm looking up grape meaning. Oh, okay. It's short for grape shot, which is ammunition consisting of a number of small iron balls fired together from a cannon. Okay. Well, that was the greatest speech since Bragg nominated Cleveland. Roosevelt continued to argue and to say he refused to give my speech. Finally, about midnight, I got up and said, Frank, we're all exhausted. I have just enough authority from the governor to tell you you'll either make that speech or none at all. And he said, oh, I'll make the goddamnedest speech and it'll be a flop. The laughter, which boomed out at the Tiger Room or the Biltmore Suite when Swope or Proskauer repeated the story, and they repeated it often, helped to blind the men sitting in those jovial watering holes to developing traits in Roosevelt's character. And more important, it blinded them also to the fact that while he was completely loyal to Smith, he was using his position as a campaigner for a presidential candidate to keep in touch with key Democrats across the country in preparation for a presidential bid of his own. They never guessed that he even had a timetable, a run for the governorship in 1932 and the presidency in 1936. As one Roosevelt biographer put it, the Smith advisors regarded their acquisition as no more than a showy but harmless piece of window dressing. All the advisors, that is, except one, sitting in a corner of the Biltmore Suite, away from the laughter, Belle Moskowitz, who had seen in the 30-year-old failure Robert Moses something no one else had seen, was watching a, quote, harmless Franklin Roosevelt. And by 1924, she had come to the conclusion that he was a threat, a very dangerous threat, to her dream that Alfred E. Smith would one day sit in the White House. The other advisors didn't take this view seriously. For once, they said, Mrs. M was wrong. I'll probably read one more page. In 1924, when Smith appointed Moses president of the Long Island State Park Commission, the governor appointed Roosevelt chairman of the Taconic State Park Commission. The thin veneer of friendliness between Moses and Roosevelt thereupon flaked off abruptly and completely. Moses would attribute the break to a single incident revolving around gnarled, emaciated little Lewis M. Howe. Imagine, you kind of get forgotten to history, and then in a huge seminal book, your only description is gnarled, emaciated little, like, oh, gnarled, emaciated little Annie. Roosevelt's devoted advisor, whom Smith Circle, because of his habitually dirty, sweat-stained collars and sweets dotted with food stains and flecked with cigarette ashes, called Lousy Louie. So this is Roosevelt's advisor, Lousy Louie. This is when Roosevelt. So he's basically like the Robert Moses to Smith is like Lousy Louie to FDR. When Roosevelt attempted to appoint Howe secretary of the Taconic Commission, Moses stepped in. If Roosevelt wanted a secretary and valet, he said, he would have to pay him himself. Getting Howe the secretary's job, which paid $5,000 per year, was important to Roosevelt. And Howe is Lousy Louie. Unable to move around freely, he knew that he would be able to remain in politics only if he was able to delegate most of the tasks he had formerly performed himself. He therefore needed to have an organization, even if it was only 1 or 2 or 3 secretaries, but he had to have Howe, Lousy Louie, to direct them and to represent him at political meetings he himself could no longer attend. And he was not financially able to pay Howe an adequate salary. Howe had been about to accept a lucrative offer from private industry when Roosevelt was stricken, but as soon as he learned of the tragedy at Campobello, he had declined the job. Roosevelt had to find a place for him on some governmental payroll, and the only governmental body on which Roosevelt had held an official position in 1924 was the Taconic Commission. But Moses was adamant. The State Parks Council would veto any salary for Howe as secretary, Moses said. Moses was always to contend that the bad blood between him and Roosevelt flowed from this single incident. Howe never forgave him for the valet insult, he said, and took every opportunity to poison Roosevelt's mind against him. You see, Moses would tell the author, Roosevelt was in such terrible physical shape that he was home at night a lot, and a person in that kind of condition is very susceptible to the people who are there with him in that house all night. And Howe was always there, and Roosevelt would listen to his stories. It was a result of his illness. He was susceptible to that kind of thing. That was a big Robert Moses quote. But the feeling between Moses and Roosevelt burned too deep to be attributable to a single incident. Personality may have had something to do with it. Moses, after all, was not the only one of the 2 men whom Albany had found arrogant. Moses was not the only one of the 2 men who had been given a sip of power, who had liked the taste, and who wanted more. And much of the feeling was certainly due to the fact that during the early 1920s, Moses was not the only one of the 2 men dreaming about parks and parkways. During the same years that Robert Moses was tramping the hills and beaches of Long Island, envisioning great parks and parkways there, Franklin Roosevelt was tramping in his imagination the hills and rolling farmland of his native Dutchess County, envisioning great parks and parkways there. His ideas were on a scale as big as Moses's. And in the park system that Moses was building, there was room for only one man with big ideas. Okay, I think I'm going to call it there. Page 288. I'll probably read again tomorrow. That was a really fun. I read for such a long time because that was so fun. I love when we like go from having really, in my opinion, somewhat boring in the weeds, like court fights, to having a big profile of a new person, because that happened with Al Smith and it was the best. Okay, see you later. Have a good Friday and weekend.